I never thought I'd be uncomfortable around my grandfather. But one day, everything changed. I could feel something strange in the way he looked at me, something I couldn't quite understand. And it felt wrong. Growing up, I was close to my grandfather. He was always kind and took an interest in my life in a way that made me feel important. He'd been a strong father figure, someone I looked up to. I felt safe and respected around him, always. So, when my mom suggested I spend a few weeks with him while she was away on a work trip, I didn't think twice. I remember the first few days with him were just like old times. We'd watch movies, talk about everything, and he'd cook my favorite meals. But after a few days, I noticed something off. It was small at first, barely noticeable, but enough to make me feel watched. One evening, as we sat in the living room, I felt his gaze linger a bit too long. I'd never seen him look at me like that before, and it made me uncomfortable. I tried to shake off the feeling, thinking maybe I was just overreacting. But in the back of my mind, something told me to be careful. Then, one night, I woke up suddenly, feeling uneasy. The house was quiet, and I thought it was probably just a bad dream. But as I lay there, trying to fall back asleep, I heard faint footsteps outside my bedroom door. My heart skipped a beat. Why would he be outside my room in the middle of the night? The footsteps stopped, and after a few moments, I heard the door handle turn slightly. At that moment, I felt frozen, unsure of what to do. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe he was just checking on me. But a part of me felt like there was more to it. I didn't move, holding my breath, hoping he'd just leave. The door never opened, and eventually the footsteps faded down the hallway. I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what had just happened. And why had I felt so nervous, even scared? The next morning, I tried to act normal, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling from the night before. I told myself it was silly. I mean, this was my grandfather. He'd practically raised me, and there was no way he meant any harm. Yet, the memory of those footsteps haunted me, like a quiet whisper in the back of my mind that wouldn't go away. At breakfast, I noticed him watching me again, his eyes lingering a little longer than usual. I forced myself to ignore it, keeping the conversation light. He talked about plans for the day, suggesting we go out to the lake, something we used to do when I was younger. I agreed, thinking maybe some fresh air would help ease the tension I was feeling. When we got to the lake, things felt almost normal again. We laughed, took some photos, and he even told me stories from when he was younger. But then, as we sat on a bench overlooking the water, he reached over to put his arm around me, just like he used to. Only this time, it felt different. It was as if the warmth and comfort I'd always associated with his touch had been replaced with something unfamiliar, something that didn't feel right. I pulled away slightly, pretending I needed to adjust my seat. He looked at me, a flash of something unreadable in his eyes. For a split second, it felt like he knew I was uncomfortable, like he could sense that something between us had shifted. But instead of asking if I was okay, he just gave me a small smile and suggested we head back home. As the day went on, I couldn't help but replay that moment in my head. I kept wondering if I was reading too much into things. After all, he hadn't really done anything wrong, right? But my gut told me something was off, that I needed to be cautious. Still, I brushed it aside, convincing myself that it was all just my imagination. That night, though, the footsteps returned. This time, they were slower, as if he were lingering just outside my door. I lay there, frozen, my heart pounding as I listened to every sound. I was terrified, but I didn't know why. And when the door handle jiggled again, I held my breath, praying he wouldn't come in. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard him walk away. The silence that followed was overwhelming, and even though nothing had happened, a fear I couldn't explain gripped me. I knew something was wrong, but I still didn't know what to do. The following morning, I decided I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I needed someone to talk to. Someone who could tell me if I was just overthinking or if there was actually something to be concerned about. So, I texted my best friend, explaining everything that had happened. The lingering looks, the footsteps outside my room, and the strange way he acted at the lake. After reading my messages, she called me immediately, her voice full of concern. She urged me to be careful and suggested that I keep my door locked at night, just to be safe. Her worry made my fears feel more real, and it was the first time I felt like maybe I wasn't imagining things. That night, I did as she said and locked my door before going to bed. I felt a bit more at ease, but I still couldn't shake the uneasiness. Every little sound seemed amplified, making it hard to fall asleep. I tossed and turned, glancing at the door every few minutes, half expecting to see the handle move again. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud bang. I sat up, my heart racing, as I realized someone was trying to open my door. The handle was rattling, harder this time, as if whoever was on the other side was frustrated that it wouldn't open. My heart pounded, and I felt a mix of fear and disbelief wash over me. Why was he trying to get into my room in the middle of the night? "Grandpa?" I called out, my voice shaky. There was no answer, just a heavy silence on the other side of the door. After a few moments, the rattling stopped, and I heard footsteps retreating down the hallway. I sat there, staring at the door, feeling a sense of dread I couldn't explain. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay silent any longer. Over breakfast, I tried to keep my voice steady as I brought it up. "Hey, Grandpa, did you come by my room last night?" He looked at me, his face unreadable. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just stared at me as if measuring my reaction. Finally, he gave a slight shrug and said, "I thought I heard something. Just wanted to make sure you were okay." His answer was simple, casual, like there was nothing unusual about it. But something in his tone felt off. It wasn't the reassuring response I'd been hoping for. Instead, it left me feeling more unsettled, like there was something he wasn't telling me. I nodded, trying to act like I believed him. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The rest of the day passed in a tense silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, studying me, and waiting for something. I kept my distance, staying out of his way as much as possible. But I knew that sooner or later I'd have to confront him, to get to the bottom of whatever was going on between us. That night, I lay in bed with my door locked, my nerves on edge. I couldn't take another sleepless night full of fear and uncertainty. I decided that if I heard footsteps again, I would confront him, no matter how uncomfortable or difficult it might be. I needed to know the truth, whatever it was. Around midnight, the silence in the house was broken by the familiar sound of footsteps approaching my door. I felt my body tense up, my pulse quickening. I waited, listening as he came closer. Just as he reached my door, I threw off the covers and swung my legs over the edge of the bed, preparing myself to finally face him. The doorknob rattled, and I stood up, crossing the room with a mix of fear and determination. I unlocked the door and opened it abruptly, startling him. There he stood, looking at me with a mixture of surprise and something else. Something I couldn't quite place. For a moment, we both just stared at each other in silence. "Why are you outside my door every night?" I asked, my voice steady but my heart racing. I wanted answers, and I wasn't backing down. He looked away, his expression tense. I just wanted to make sure you were okay," he muttered, but his words felt hollow, insincere. It was the same excuse he'd used before, but it didn't explain why he was there every night, or why his presence made me feel so uncomfortable. I took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage I had. "Grandpa, this isn't normal. You're making me feel uneasy. If you care about me, you need to respect my space." He looked at me for a long time, something shifting in his expression. And finally, he nodded, almost reluctantly. "I'm sorry if I made you feel that way," he said quietly, his voice softening. There was a weight in his gaze, something that almost resembled regret. After that night, he stopped lingering outside my door. The strange tension between us faded, though the memory of those nights stayed with me. I spent the rest of my time there keeping my distance, counting down the days until I could leave. By the time I left, things were different between us. Strained, unspoken. I never confronted him again, but I made a promise to myself to trust my instincts, to never let my guard down if I felt uncomfortable. And even though I'll never fully understand what happened during those nights, I knew that listening to my gut had kept me safe.